Last year, we at Four Collectors hosted the first ever vintage trade night in cooperation with the Strongsville Sports Collectors Convention, and it was a massive success. With the help of our generous sponsors, Collector Investor Auctions, and a few of my favorite things, we are doing it again. After the show on Saturday, April 11th, come to the Independence Holiday Inn for free admission, giveaways, door prizes, and free pizza. This year, it's going to be bigger and better, so be there.
Got this at trade night, at vintage trade night.
Did you really? I didn't know that.
I've been looking for this all week.
Who'd you buy it off?
It's not downstairs, it was up here.
Wow.
This is the place to be.
There it is. The place to be, Four Collectors. Good evening, sports cards fans, and welcome back to Four Collectors. My name is Dan. I have a channel, as you know, Dan's Vintage Baseball PC, and I am so happy to welcome back to Four Collectors, Four Collectors' favorite author, Luke Epplin. How are you, sir, this evening?
Hey, Dan, I'm doing great.
So if our viewers will remember, Luke was on the show a little over a year ago to talk about this book, Our Team, which covered four different primary players and owner from the 1948 Indians. We had a wonderful discussion with some other people, but Luke is back because of this, Moses and the Doctor, a book that I have had the great fortune of reading this weekend. It came out, February 20th, I think, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I had ordered it from the Astoria bookstore, which is over the other side of the river to me. And they sent it to me with some special things and a nice little inscription. So there you go. So, Luke, thank you so much for coming back on. I really, really enjoyed this book. Just tell the viewers, if you can, how did this start? I know how it started, you mentioned it, but what was the real sort of impetus to cover this particular subject matter?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned my first book, Our Team, because that is a book about two different leagues coming into contact with each other, the Negro Leagues and the Major Leagues, both before and after integration, whether it was with barnstorming or whenever integration actually happens. And I told it from the point of view of four different individuals. And whenever I pitched that book to my publisher, I was not aware of how rich that subject matter was. And I can remember distinctly writing the book and thinking, wow, I have hit upon a baseball story that I'll just never be able to duplicate. It's just so, it has everything. It's got war, it's got barnstorming, it's got Satchel Paige, it's got World Series. And so I decided that I just wasn't going to try because everything was going to pale in comparison. But what I did like was this idea of two different leagues coming together, creating tension and friction. And my favorite sport as a kid was basketball. I grew up in Southern Illinois at a time when Michael Jordan was the god. And so anybody in that time really, where I grew up was just a Michael Jordan aficionado. And so I wanted to pivot toward there, but I wanted to keep certain elements of Our Team in place. Namely, I wanted to think if there was a similar sort of situation that was happening in basketball history, which is when I started thinking about the American Basketball Association. And the ABA immediately grabbed my attention. I wanted to write about it, and I wanted to write about the friction that happened whenever the ABA merged with the NBA. And I think kind of novelistically, and I really wanted to find a character that could sort of lead us through that transition. And really, there was only one choice. It had to be Julius Erving. Julius Erving himself is the embodiment of the ABA. Even the way he looks like the ABA. And so that's really where I started with Dr. J.
So we talked a little before we started recording. My background is very much an ABA background. And our viewers think of me probably only as a vintage baseball guy. But I am an ABA aficionado because when I was a kid, I lived in a town that was next to the town where Julius Erving grew up in, and two towns away from the town where Nassau Coliseum is located. Nassau Coliseum is located technically in Uniondale. My barber as a kid was in Uniondale, so that's how close I was to that team. And I saw probably, half a dozen ABA games, including an ABA finals game. And as I told you on the in the intro, and I talked about this on my own channel, that one time my basketball team as a youth, I don't know how or what the connection was, but we got down onto the court during warm-ups of a Nets game, and I was 5 to 10 feet away from Dr. J during when they were in their warm-ups. I don't remember doing the dunks like you talk about in the book, but I do remember it very distinctly. And for me, I was a white kid growing up in a white town next to a black town. And if you know that Long Island back then, it's traditionally was segregated because, the whole Levittown thing and the, white flight and the cities and stuff. So there was kind of a racial element to it that comes out a little bit in this book. But I loved it. I was an ABA fan from the beginning, and we'll talk about this when we get through the cards, but to me, it was one of those things where I was too young to have developed prejudices, and my parents were not prejudiced people. So it was good for me to be able to get out and see that Black people could be, terrific ambassadors. And the Nets, I'm talking too much. I'll get to a question here. The Nets in on Long Island, in that area, were ambassadors to the community. And we met them at various different events and stuff. So it was really cool to have an ABA team so close. And it really touched me because going into this book, I thought it was going to be about the Sixers, but there's a really big chunk of this book that's about the ABA, and I couldn't stop reading. So
that's great.
How do you, from your vantage point, you're obviously not as old as I am, but from your vantage point, what is there an identity that the ABA had that the NBA could never quite capture?
Definitely. The ABA sort of took on the character of the underdog organization that it was. It was a shoestring league. It was sort of constantly on the verge of, if not outright collapse, at least sort of financial hardship. And so it needed to improvise, be creative, spontaneous in order to stay afloat. And I like to think of that bleeding into the play of the players at that time. It offered a more wide open game with the 3-point line, with the lack of sort of the big centers that you had in NBA basketball, and with a lot of players that were taken from more playground oriented courts, such as Julius Erving. And it really was the perfect laboratory for Erving to develop the moves that he is now known for. In the NBA, there was this sort of idea that it was a very coach-oriented league, very stodgy, traditional, and coaches sort of ran the show over there. There was a lot more freedom for ABA players to improvise, experiment, do what kind of came naturally to them in a more outdoor setting and bring that indoors. And Julius Erving himself it was serendipitous for him because he really thought about himself as an artist from a very young age. If you read interviews with Dr. J when he's like 21 years old, he's talking about his artistry, his art. He knows that there are different ways of playing basketball that are more beautiful and interesting than others. And so he's not only practicing jump shots and free throws, he's practicing those moves where he starts on one side of the basket, goes to the other. He's practicing the dunks that he's going to do. He's dreaming of the moves and the dunks. And so that by the time he unleashes them in actual gameplay, they're not some sort of trick shot that he's doing for to excite the crowd. They are part of a natural process of how his game evolved. And so that he basically took those moves and made them fundamental to the way that he played. A coach could not pull Dr. J from the game because what he was doing was not circus-like. What he was doing was, in fact, it was a high percentage shot. And so, the ABA allowed Dr. J to really cultivate that style of play.
Well, he couldn't dunk when he was in college at Massachusetts. So, and I really like that you covered a really good chunk of the whole Rucker experience, because I think Rucker gave him the kind of, the competition and the kind of freedom and the way to play a game that was able to be transitioned into the ABA, and you could never transition that into the NBA.
I talked to a couple of people who played at Rucker with Dr. J. This would have been in the early 1970s. And they told me that really the legend of Dr. J is born on those playgrounds. They're not born in high school, where Dr. J was a pretty lightly recruited person because he hadn't hit a growth spurt yet. They're not born in college because, as you said, dunking is outlawed. And so the nation doesn't get to see the full Dr. J experience. They're like, the legend of Dr. J is cultivated on these outdoor playground courts, where by the time he becomes an ABA professional, thousands of people are coming out to see him play in New York City. They're going on rooftops, they're climbing trees, they're going on fences. He is somebody who has a legend before he's played a single moment of professional basketball. And it helps that he then goes in the ABA, a league that has no television contract. And so you didn't see Dr. J, you heard about Dr. J.
Yeah,
and that's the sort of thing. He's the last legend in sports. Someone like Michael Jordan, you see his clips nightly. You can watch his games. You can do things like that. But Dr. J, you couldn't. And so you can only hear from word of mouth about somebody in Long Island who is doing these moves that defied belief.
Well, we did eventually get Nets games on WOR Channel 9. So I did see Dr. J on TV, but that's later on. That's when he gets to the Nets, which is 73 or 4. So he ends up going from Massachusetts, signing what they called the hardship at the time, and being signed. I guess he went to play for Al Bianchi. Al Bianchi ended up being on one of the general managers, I think, for the Nets later on when they were in the NBA, but definitely an NBA stalwart in the old days. And the way that he got to Virginia is just kind of blows my mind. I mean, it's just like happenstance almost.
Yeah, the Virginia Squires, he signs with a team called the Virginia Squires. They were an odd team in that they didn't have like a home city. They would play in 4 different cities across the state. And the Dr. J had signed with a sports agent after his junior year in college. This agent, Steve Arnold, contacts Al Bianchi and says, we've got this amazing guy at UMass. They'd never seen him play before. But they drafted him, they signed him, and when he comes into training camp, they have no idea what they have on their hands. And then the first time they see him practice, they're like, "Oh my gosh, like this guy is doing crazy stuff." And so it really was just fortuitous that they were able to get him.
And I thought that whole sort of I didn't know this, that Dr. J's first professional game, in exhibition game, was at the same arena in Petersburg where Moses Malone, I guess, played a high school championship. They literally were intersecting as early as Moses in high school.
You know, my last book, Our Team, opens in 1936 when Bob Feller, who's a 17-year-old rookie, pitches an exhibition game against Satchel Paige during the barnstorming season after Feller's rookie year in Cleveland. And I was really like, wow, these two people were intertwined from the start, and their paths were crossing over and over and over again. And I started to see the same pattern with Dr. J and Moses Malone, where there is something where these two become connected even before they make it into the NBA. There are these bonds that bring them together. And then once they make it to the NBA, they're trading MVPs, they're trading finals appearances. It's almost like they're circling and they need each other. If only they could come together.
Right. And then there's the Moses debut in the ABA, not his debut, like his 4th game, maybe, where Dr. J takes the microphone and gives a speech, which, was kind of unbelievable. I had never heard of that either.
Well, that was I'll say 2 things about that. First of all, whenever I interviewed Julius Erving and I asked him about Moses Malone, and I think I said something along the lines of, you and Moses were so different, both on and off the court. How did you ever establish some sort of camaraderie? Because I can't imagine 2 different people. And he says, well, you have to remember that I gave a speech about Moses Malone before I'd even met him. Like, we were always bonded. Like, we didn't need to be, camaraderie. We had it since the very start. So to just tell the story, Moses Malone is this incredibly recruited high school player. He's a prodigy. He's someone that everyone knows is going to be a super duper star. He gets signed by the University of Maryland. The ABA swoops in and signs him at the very last minute. Moses decides to skip directly to the pros. He's the first high school player to skip college altogether and become professional. And it caused a lot of controversy at the time. A lot of people thought that this was a bad example to set for the youth, that they were robbing Moses Malone of an education, et cetera, et cetera. And so the ABA realized that if that experiment was going to, if that controversy was going to die down, they needed Dr. J to basically bless it. And in order to understand why, you have to understand that Dr. J always sort of considered or carried himself as an ambassador to professional basketball, whether he was in the ABA or the NBA. There were two different people. There was Dr. J on the court, spontaneous, wild, inventive, creative. And there was Julius Erving off the court. And Julius Erving was almost conservative. He was a business-like person. He was signing every autograph, talking to every reporter, doing whatever the ABA needed him to do to stay afloat, basically. And so when the ABA says, look, you're just going to have to give a speech before this game, before you play this guy, he didn't even bat an eye. And he just comes up with this incredibly eloquent, articulate speech about Moses being ready to play. And it's like controversy over. Then he strips off his warm-ups and kills them on the court. And so it's just this great sort of encapsulation of the two different sides of Julius Erving. And he can sort of code switch between them whenever he needs to.
And then, you know, the parallel of Moses Malone playing style, which is relentless, never giving up, and constantly hitting the boards, versus like the way he went through his early career. I mean, he's in Utah. They fold. He ends up with a completely crazy team in St. Louis. Then the ABA folds. Then he gets sent to Portland. Then he's with Buffalo for like a week. And then he finally finds a home in Houston. But if you think about it, a kid at the time, he's what, 20 years old?
Yeah, something like that.
A kid going through all of those different changes in that point of their life is not going to survive to be the player that Moses Malone eventually became, unless that's in their DNA.
Yeah,
I think
that's a rocky churn for Moses, because Moses is somebody who's introverted. He's distrustful of people outside of a tight inner circle. He really wants to sort of establish a home for himself. And he really got comfortable in Utah when he got drafted by the Utah Stars. He liked his teammates. He liked Ron Boone. He liked Gerald Govan, all of these people around him. And when the Utah Stars fold, Moses, it affects his playing style. He's no longer the player that he was. And it takes him a good year and a half to really recover from that, all that sort of being tossed about. And the sort of irony is that Moses, I think, wanted nothing more than to just like put down roots and stay there and just kind of build a home around himself. Yet his career is defined by constant churn. I call it the Odyssey in the book. He's just batted around the league. He's, signs with something like 11 teams throughout his career. I mean, he's a journeyman, and it's odd that he's a journeyman considering how amazing he was.
Yeah, I mean, he spent maybe 6 years in Houston. And then 3 or 4 in Philly, but before that, he's all over the place, and after that, he's all over the place. And I found it interesting. We talk about St. Louis. That the first blurb on the back is Bob Costas, who, if you read Terry Pluto's book, which I'm sure you did, the Loose Balls book, which I read many years ago, fantastic ABA story. Bob Costas was one of the sort of narrators in that book. He was a play-by-play announcer for the Spirit of St. Louis. So it's interesting that kind of is a connection back to the sort of original ABA book. Did you speak to Bob Costas at all during this, or is he just did the blurb?
I was unable to get a hold of him, and then one day, whenever my book was basically done, I got a call from a New York City number, and I did not answer it. And Bob Costas was on the other line. He left a message, and he had read our team and got my information and wanted to just say how much he liked it. And so then I said, I'm from St. Louis. Bob lived in St. Louis forever. I think his wife, his first wife was from St. Louis, and they lived in St. Louis for a long time. I used to, when I would fly from New York to St. Louis, I think I was on a flight with him maybe 2 or 3 times. And at one time I went up to him and we talked for maybe 10 minutes on the plane. He probably didn't like that, but I did. So I'd known him a little bit before then, but then I told him about my book. And so, yeah, we did talk, and then he said, send it to me and I'll see if I like it. So he was very gracious in giving me a blurb.
Yes. Yeah. Nice blurb. But you sort of, I mean, your narrative is very different. Terry Pluto's narrative is basically kind of, it's more of a comedic book. Yours is more of a serious book, but the Spirit of St. Louis was a comedy team. Basically that team was a mess. And then they ended up upsetting the Nets in the first round of the playoffs one year.
Yeah. Do you remember that?
I don't remember it. It. Yeah, it's weird. I don't remember that. But yeah, I mean, I would have watched whatever games of that series was on Channel 9, WOR. I did not go to any of those games, but I probably suppressed it in the back of my memory. I do remember the last ABA game because it was also on WOR and it's on YouTube.
Yeah.
When the Nets beat Denver, they came back from a 20-point deficit and beat Denver to win the ABA championship in 6 games. And at the time, 76, I'm 12 years old, 12 and a half years old. I don't have any concept of this. Teams keep changing. It's like, that's what life is. The Memphis Tams become the Denver Rockets used to be in LA, and Virginia Squires are, playing in 4 different places, and Pittsburgh Condors leave. And that's like, that to me was normal. But the concept of that game, that might be the last ABA game, which I think at this point, if you were an adult, you'd be like, yeah, that's probably the last game. I didn't even realize it at the time. And so that sort of concept of the merger was, I don't know, it was kind of exciting to me. And it kind of was exciting to the NBA public because, as you mentioned in your book, the first game between ABA and NBA teams as NBA teams was going to be on CBS, and it was going to be the Nets against, I forget
the Golden State Warriors. Yeah, the
Golden State Warriors, yeah. And I remember being excited about that game, thinking that Dr. J was going to be playing. I guess it was Barry would have been, my former favorite player with the Nets in the old days. And then they sell him. And I was old enough to know that this was not going to be good, that the money thing was going to be a problem. I come to have read about it a lot since then, but you didn't really have a chance to cover it as well because it's not really a point in the story, that it's just sort of a plot point, but it's not like the whole story. But that is one of those traumatic childhood events that ends my childhood, when Dr. J gets sold from the Nets to the Philadelphia 76ers, just swept us, taken away, just knocked us over. And, it was hard. I still have trauma from it. And it's like, I hate Roy Bowe more than maybe anybody else in sports. And so, I mean, but you're an adult and a writer, and you covered it pretty objectively. And one of the things that you covered that I didn't really know that much about was the whole contract thing with his agent. So walk us through that a little bit, if you can.
So Dr. J, when he comes to the Nets from the Virginia Squires, he already has a history of breaking contracts. He was upset about his contract with the Virginia Squires, which he didn't realize that this person, Steve Arnold, who originally, signed him, had some sort of dealings with the ABA. And so he was compromised with the league, and he thought that he got a raw deal with the Virginia Squires. So he breaks it, tries to go to the NBA, sign with the Atlanta Hawks. He loses in court, has to go back to Virginia, and then he gets out of the contract, and the Nets buy him basically and give him a 7-year deal, which is, I can't remember the exact amount of money, but it's a pretty hefty sum for the ABA. There is this idea that midway through the deal, the Nets would throw in a little sweetener, a little just kind of under the table bonus for him. And whenever the leagues merge, that's almost the exact midway point. So Dr. J's agent goes to the Nets and says, we need that sweetener right now. And whenever they don't get it, because, Roy Bowe is, understandably so, sort of strapped by all these onerous terms that the NBA has placed on these ABA teams coming into the league, and he can't afford to give Dr. J that money right now. Julius Erving sits out the training camp and will not report to the Nets facilities until he gets that money. And so I know that a lot of Nets fans really pinned it on Roy Bowe, and I do think that Bowe probably could have done it. I think Bill Melchione, who was the general manager of the Nets at the time, also a former player, was talking about how if they understood the worth of Dr. J to the team, they could have, put together the money and given it whatever it took to placate him. But at the same time, he did have several years left on that contract, and there was no idea that he should have or could have done this. And whenever Julius, eventually that he gets sold to the 76ers for money, and he's really unhappy in Philadelphia for many years until basically 1980. And I think that he didn't take into account how how much of a home he'd established in on the Nets, and how much that team was built around him, so that whenever he does go into the Sixers, he's not able to bring Dr. J out as much as he wants to, because he's tentative, he's out of shape. It's not his team. It's led by this guy named George McGinnis, and Julius is deferring to him in a way that he didn't have to on the Nets. And so I really do think that an alternate timeline where Julius stays with the Nets would have resulted in him being much more, I mean, we got a great experience in Philadelphia, but it could have been even better if he would have stayed with the Nets because of how the roster was built around his strengths. And so, yeah, I think he, for a long time, regretted that decision.
They brought in Tiny Archibald,
Mm-hmm.
and that was an exciting thing for a little while before we lost Dr. J. It was going to be Tiny and the Doctor. That was like the back, the headlines was Tiny and the Doctor, and it was going to be a big deal. But, when Archibald was without anybody else, I mean, that team was vacant after Dr. J left.
Yeah.
And they didn't have any money. So it was not a great experience. But the 76-77 Philadelphia 76ers are maybe my least favorite team of all time.
Oh, no.
Because, okay, this is the team that stole our hero.
Mm-hmm.
George McGinnis was an unlikable guy. I mean, you sort of captured a little bit. He's an unlikable guy, and he had a terrible game. He was basically just like a bruiser.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest, Lloyd B. Free was just a chucker.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't like the team at all. And what's interesting about it is that I am certain that at the 77 finals that I rooted really hard for Portland. And it wasn't because they were the white team and the 76ers were the black team. It was because that 76er team, I resented them so much. So I think you captured obviously a much more sort of three-dimensional version of that, how the old ABA, the old NBA in the 76ers, let me check that. The old NBA, sort of the Portland Trailblazers versus like the new NBA, the sort of ABA transplants coming in and playing new sort of, in a way, a playground style. And they clash in that finals, and the good guys win. I thought your book really captured that very well.
That was the sort of thing. That was the moment whenever I realized that Julius Erving coming over from the ABA, there was a lot of prejudice against the ABA from sort of stalwart NBA people. They thought that the ABA was kind of a circus league, a minor league, not as up to par with the NBA, and that style that Julius played, which was more sort of ripped from the playground, sort of street ball thing, wasn't going to fly in NBA competition. And so the Sixers from the very start, with George McGinnis, with Julius Erving, with Caldwell Jones, they get pegged as the ABA team. And that kind of continues throughout the rest of his career, because up until the 1983 finals, when he finally wins an NBA championship, he never plays with less than two ABA superstars on the team. And he's eventually coached by Billy Cunningham, who also played in the ABA. And so the Sixers carry this sort of stigma of being in the ABA. And all that carries, I think it also carries a racial component. I think the ABA was no more of an African-American league. And I think that really clings on to them as well. And then, of course, you have in the Trailblazers, Bill Walton, the sort of white, consummate, selfless player, and Jack Ramsey, who is, your sort of prototypical bald white coach who had the playbook as big as an encyclopedia. And it really was, some viewed it almost existentially, that if the Sixers won, that was it. Then it was just going to be street ball from there on out. And so whenever they lost, it was like a sigh of relief that, the league, that these ABA guys maybe don't have what it takes.
Yeah. And, that sort of down period when, Sixers lose, but then they don't get to the finals again until I think 1980. And Walton gets hurt, and now, were they in Washington at this point, but the Bullets end up in the finals in Seattle, and it's a mess. And, I agree with the premise in your book that the the Larry Bird and Magic Johnson saved the NBA isn't the whole story. That there's a much bigger story that involves a lot of other players, and two of whom are profiled in your book. And I agree with that. But it's, it's more complicated than that. But it's at some point, Dr. J, and I remember this when it happened because I remember the first time I saw it, cuts off the afro. And suddenly he's an elder statesman playing an NBA game, and now he has a comeback from a couple of down years, and he becomes the MVP again, and they make the finals again. And that becomes this sort of, and at that point, Bird and Magic are in the league, and I think that's when the league took off. And it's almost like Dr. J had to change his image in order to, be more NBA-like, and it ended up working out for him in a way.
Yeah. And that's the one of the things that really surprised me too. Dr. J, Julius Erving, was really deliberate in everything he did. We think about him as being creative and spontaneous and inventive, but even those moves were ones that he'd practiced over and over and over. He's a really thoughtful, meditative guy. And he kind of gets stuck onto this team with the Sixers, as you said, with a lot of gunners, a lot of sort of maybe not the best practice players, things like that. And they have to get rid of these guys. They have to shed them one by one and build a team more in keeping with what he had on the New York Nets. So they bring in people like Bobby Jones, and then they draft Maurice Cheeks and Andrew Toney. And it starts to become more of a team-like atmosphere. And sort of the final stage of that is exactly what you said. Julius Erving, coming into the season where he finally gets back to the finals, shaves off his sort of signature afro that he'd had since, college, basically. And that afro was such a symbol of his playground look, his the sort of inventiveness of the ABA. That's an iconic image of Julius Erving with the hair sticking up like that. But he takes it off and he becomes more of like a business person, more of a mature individual, not somebody that's just going to be flying through the air, but is going to be having a more rounded, mellow game. And it's with that rounded, mellow game and the team around him that he has that surge where he makes it to the finals 3 out of 4 years.
Yeah, and then Moses is sort of quietly built himself back up to be, in some respect, one of the best certainly one of the best big men, if not the best big man in the league, winning an MVP on his own, taking an under 500 team to the finals, which, was pretty much himself doing it alone. I mean, as much as some of those other guys were pretty good, Tom Jonovich and Calvin Murphy. And so, I mean, they're both, I think, at that point have almost by force of will turned themselves from, having been castaways in a way to now like centerpieces in the NBA. And like I said, that part of the story is not thought of as much as the Bird Magic, save the NBA. Those guys were the foundation of how the league ended up surviving, was getting players like Moses and Dr. J.
Yeah, if you look at Julius's record on the Sixers from 1976 when he enters the league to 1983 when he finally wins the championship, the Sixers have more wins than any other team during that era. They have more wins than the Lakers, the Celtics, all of that. And Julius Erving and Moses Malone are winning sort of 4 MVPs among them. It's really a little micro generation there that's not thought of as much because there's only one championship among them, and that's whenever they finally team up together. I think if Julius had somehow been able to win 1 or 2 more, he would have had more of a sort of footprint in that conversation with Bird and Magic, both of whom get drafted onto teams that are sort of instantly great. Yeah. And it is confusing, but if you go back to that time period, Bird and Magic are certainly there, and they're blocking Julius Erving's path whenever he should be marching forward. But you wouldn't have had that conversation back then about sort of the players that are going to uplift the league without including Dr. J in there, because arguably he was more popular than either of them at that point.
That's true. I mean, that's a good point. And then they lose the finals before the year before they get Malone. Malone wins the MVP. And I'm thinking it seems pretty obvious from your book that Malone would not have ended up on Philadelphia if the ownership had not changed, if Katz had not purchased the team. Is that fair to say?
That is absolutely right. The 76ers were owned by this guy named Fitz Dixon, who was a sort of millionaire, kind of came into his wealth, didn't really know anything about basketball, just kind of bought the team because it was a toy of his. And then he got sick of it because the Sixers kept breaking everybody's heart. And so he sells it to Harold Katz, who was this scrappy street guy from Philadelphia who started Nutrisystem and, was really kind of a, classic American striver. But what he did love was basketball. He was there at all the games. He was there in all the seasons, even when the Sixers were terrible. And he had his goal to really make the Sixers a champion. And I'll say one thing about that 1982 season. There's an image of that season where Julius Erving makes it to the finals for the third time in 6 years. He loses to the Los Angeles Lakers. And the 76ers have to close the locker room after the final game because Julius Erving is crying in the locker room. And they just don't want people getting those photos out. And it's a shocking image because Julius Erving is known as Mr. Cool. Like he is just, he hardly even seemed to sweat. It's like his emotions weren't on his sleeve in that way. And whenever I read those accounts, this was before I'd even started, writing my proposal for the book, I came across like a paragraph or two about Dr. J crying. And I was like, that's the book. There it is right there. I need to build up to what is it about that moment that makes Julius Erving cry? And I do think it is, he does not know at that moment that Moses Malone is about to join him. He thinks that that's it, that I'm never going to win. I'm never going to get another shot at the title. I'm getting a little older. Bird and Magic are there. I can't get through them on my own. And it doesn't look like I'm going to get help. And so at that moment, he's at the lowest he can be. And that's where I was like, the book has to build into that moment so that then there's the release whenever he finally does win it.
And I have to say that when they got Moses, I felt like that there was no chance that anybody was going to beat them. And it played out until like the injuries near the end of the season. They were completely dominant for almost the entire season. For like 90% of the season, they were unbeatable. And that whole 70-win prediction could have come true, except for Moses' knees and,
Erving. Well, you have to remember, Billy Cunningham was the coach of that team. And he had concerns about adding Moses because George McGinnis and Julius Erving were not good teammates together. They were duplicative. They were doing pretty much the same thing. So they were constantly getting in each other's way or taking the ball away from each other. And so they were not a good superstar combo. And Billy Cunningham wanted to make sure that Julius Erving and Moses Malone could get past that. Were there any egos that were going to be involved? Was Moses going to be okay with, he was the reigning MVP. He could have come in and just said, I'm the man. But he not only said that this is Doc's team, and I just wanted to get this, the book is really trying to show that these two men were so opposite each other. They did such different things, both on and off the court, that it's almost like they didn't overlap at all. And it's almost like they filled in each other's deficiencies without stepping on each other's toes. And so it was such a seamless fit that once they locked into place from the start, from game one, they just ran the table because it's like they finally were like, oh, this is what I needed. And then it was like season over. Yeah.
It was the one center that Kareem could not deal with. So.
Oh, Kareem hated him, man.
But that's a really important point in the book. And I don't remember this, but when you pointed out that at his first press conference, Moses is saying, this is Doc's team.
Yeah.
And that set the tone. And they, like you said, they ran the table practically. They barely ever lost.
Yeah. And that's a really important thing.
Or something.
Yeah. Yeah. And I talked to a lot of the sort of bench players on the 76ers from that season, 1982, 1983. And they all told me the same thing when I asked them if they were perhaps a little worried about getting Moses because of adding another ego. And they were like, yes, we were. But then we watched Moses's first press conference and he kept saying, this is Doc's team. I'm just here to help. This is Doc's team. And he just repeated that even after they won the championship. He's saying, I just wanted to get Doc a ring. That's all I wanted to do. Right. And they were just like that made us like, okay, that we know Moses is on board here.
Yeah, and I what I do remember, because I watched every single game of the series, was that series against the Knicks in the second
Mm,
round. Because at that point I was a Knicks fan, and the Knicks were starting to get good after their own little sort of down period.
mhm.
And they had Bernard King, and they had, I guess, Rory Sparrow, and they had some guys, they had some decent guys, but it was basically Bernard King. Um,
Yeah,
and I watched every game of that series. I was in college at that point, and every game was close. The Knicks
right.
had a chance in every game, and it was frustrating. But I knew that Philly was a better team, and I didn't even realize until I read it in your book. I may have known at that point that they were a battered team at that point. Moses was playing on bad knees. Somebody else was hurt. I guess Tony had been hurt,
Tony, yeah,
and then Doctor was hurt. So they were playing a little under the weather, so to speak. But that particular series was really instructive to me. And at that point, I didn't hate the team, Philadelphia. They were just frustrating to watch because they were so good, and I knew they were better than the Knicks, and they won every game. And then, of
yeah,
course, they didn't do the faux. They lost one game against Milwaukee, right?
yeah.
They came close.
It's interesting you say that because I too was like kind of taken aback by the fact that even though they almost swept the playoffs that year, they only lost one game. Every single game was close. There was not a single game that they played during that
Yeah.
season's playoffs that wasn't close. And the stereotype of the Sixers during those Dr. J years, whenever he couldn't win the championship, was they would just burst out of the gates. They always had speed, and they would sort of build up these big leads going into halftime. And then they would
Right.
sputter down the stretch. Once the game tightened, once they had to play a more half court offense, they would tighten up. That team, the 82-83 Sixers, was the opposite. It took them a little while to get going. They would sometimes go into halftime down, and then they would just wear you down. It was almost like they
Yeah.
took on the character of Moses Malone, who just never seemed to tire. He was going as hard in the fourth as he was in the first quarter. And so it's like those Knicks, they could have beaten them. If they didn't have Moses Malone, they would have beaten them. But it was just like Moses just had that engine that they just prevented the teams from, coming out on top, basically.
Actually, yeah, you do have a quote. I should have mentioned Bill Cartwright was on that team too. He was the center,
Yeah,
and a
who I
player that
talked
I,
to.
I
Yeah.
enjoyed for many years. You got a quote in the book about how much he hated playing against Moses Malone too.
He didn't really
Shows.
even want to talk about it. He was just sort of like, what's there to say? He dominated me. Like, I mean, it was, and I looked at the stats and I was like, oh, he did. Like, I mean, he almost like doubled his points and rebounds. It was just like Cartwright wasn't even there in the series.
And then I remember that LA series, and they, I knew they were going to win, and they won in 4. Yeah, they won in 4, right? They swept. Yeah. And at that point, I think it was kind of like Kareem was getting a little old, and maybe I guess Worthy had gotten hurt, and so the Lakers got a little energy when Worthy was like his second and third year.
Yeah.
But I guess they win the championship, and then that's kind of it. The next year they got upset in the first round, I think, or the second round. I
By
forget.
the Nets.
Yeah.
Yeah. Almost like the Nets, karma came around and stung Dr. J for abandoning the Nets. I found that to be a really ironic thing.
Yeah.
Whenever they get Moses, Dr. J is already in his early 30s. He's approaching his mid 30s. And that might not seem too old now, but back then it was pretty ancient. And Dr. J, from having grown up on asphalt courts, his knees were shot by the time he was in his late 20s. Like he's not the same explosive force that he was. And so it's almost like, the way that I think about it is that everybody exhaled a little bit, and they kind of lost that edge that they had in 83. And, the Lakers sort of rearmed, the Celtics rearmed, getting Dennis Johnson so that they could defend Andrew Toney. And the Sixers stayed pat, thinking that they had a team that was built for a dynasty. But what they didn't see at the time was the team peaked, and it was kind of slowly downhill until afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, and Erving logged a lot of minutes, especially in the ABA, playing 4 and 5 games a week, and all those, bus rides, and his career was tough on his body, and there are a lot of players who wouldn't have been able to play as long as he played. But so let's pull up some slides, because I just want to show some folks the book. If you notice, I'm wearing a shirt that has the 1972 baseball kind of top thing on it, which is what is on the top of this book. It's that it has a real nice 70s feel, and I know you had thanked in the the artist who made this cover for you, whose name I don't remember. You can share.
Let me talk about that, because it is actually based on cards, things that are of interest to your show. So I don't know if you remember, but during the 1980s, or this would have been 1980, the early Topps cards that came out then, they had 3 different players on each card with a sort of perforated edge down the middle.
Yeah.
So you could keep the card intact, or you could sort of take off the players on each card. And I think there's a famous card that has Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Julius Erving on one card in 1980, and that's considered Magic and Bird's rookie card. And so I said to my publisher that I wanted that concept of the card, because I like this idea of Erving and Malone being on the same card but still being somehow separate. And so I was like, can you do sort of an edge so you can see there's this thing that runs down the middle of the cover that's supposed to be the perforated edge of the card. And then I said, what I also want you to do is to look at other cards. It doesn't have to be basketball, from the 1970s. Figure out what has the most 70-ish feel. Use 70s colors and just recreate that. So I do think he probably looked at the 1972 Topps cards, and that's where we got that.
That's the motif at the top there.
Yeah.
So the cover is fantastic, and then the back, you've got all the blurbs on the back. You've got some really top flight authors here. But what was nice about this, so I said I ordered it from Astoria Books. And one of the reasons I ordered it from Astoria Books on a pre-order was because of this. We got a couple of cards out of it.
Yeah, man. It's the dream.
It's like, I'll show some more cards because that's what we do on this. But I should say that this is the Dr. J version, which has, it's basically on the back. It talks about your book a little bit, which is nice. And then the Moses, which is also the same on the back. But these were limited edition. I'll put a link to Astoria Bookstore down below for people watching this to order the book. I don't know if they have any cards left, but limited edition cards
they don't. I have some, and so I'm gonna be doing some contests on my social media to give away some cards and books. So there'll be opportunities.
Yeah, I will. I'll link to obviously to your publisher and to your X and to your BlueSky account, because we connect more on BlueSky these days for reasons. But I was really happy to get these. And as you know, big Dr. J fan. So I picked up his rookie card, which of course you can see he's on the Virginia Squires. And then the card in the middle is the 1976 NBA, not NBA, the 1976 Topps set, which has NBA and ABA players in it. And Dr. J has a regular card, which is a beautiful card, but he has this card, which is an all-star, which represents the final issue card of Julius Erving in a New York Nets uniform. So kind of poignant there. And then the card on the right is one of his early 76ers cards. It's the 78 card, where he still have the afro.
Yeah.
And then I picked out, I have a complete set of the 1971 Topps set in a binder.
Right. Yeah.
And the reason I got it is the first year I collected basketball cards. And it's also the first year that ABA players are featured on Topps basketball cards. And there's, Connie Hawkins is in the NBA in this, but, you talked about Hawk a little bit early in the book, having to do mostly with his time with Dr. J in the Rucker.
Yeah, he was kind of the ruling king of Rucker Park there. And whenever Julius Erving comes, as I said, he was very lightly recruited out of high school. So it wasn't like people were like, "Oh, we got to wait for this guy." Whenever he appeared at Rucker, we were like, "Who in the world is this?" They didn't even know what to call him, and so they were calling him Little Hawk, because they thought that his game so resembled Connie Hawkins, until Julius said, "Call me the doctor." And the word got around to Connie Hawkins, who would show up at Rucker to watch Julius play, almost as if he was assessing like a rival or a threat to his throne, basically.
Yeah. And that would have come right around the time that Hawkins was playing in the NBA for Phoenix, after his early life and difficult times, and then the bullshit point shaving thing and all that stuff, and he ended up getting into the NBA and having some really monster seasons. But On the right are two guys who I think you spoke to both of them, right?
I did, yeah. I should mention Gerald Govan there in the middle. He played in every single ABA season, one of the few guys to have done that. He now lives in Jersey City, which is where I live. And so, yeah, we were able to hook up. And of course, since he's from Jersey City, which is just across the street, I mean, just across the river from New York City, he went in and played against Dr. J numerous times at Rucker too. And so he was able to talk to me about Dr. J at the Rucker as well.
Right, and a teammate of Moses, I think, what, in St. Louis?
No, in Utah, and he was really considered to be kind of like him and Ron Boone. It's nice that you have both of these together because they were more veteran players for the ABA, and they both sort of took Moses as an 18, 19-year-old and sort of taught him the ropes, showed him the way. Ron Boone would have him over to his house all the time for dinner. Ron Boone was married and had kids by that time. Moses, of course, was not. And so, yeah, they both sort of looked at themselves as being protective of him.
And Ron Boone is one of those guys that was sort of well respected in the ABA.
Mm-hmm.
One of those guys that, was the ball handler, point guard, shooting, a strong player, but also like one of those guys that was like had his head on his shoulders. So I really like the fact that he's in the book and you talk about him because, like I said, he's one of those guys that ABA fans would have much respect for. And then we move on to some later players, same set, but still interesting players in the book. Calvin Murphy, who was a very small but absolutely terrific NBA player for many years. In fact, he's in the Hall of Fame. Sort of a late career for him when he's playing with Moses, but still he's still a solid player.
I mean, I was able to talk to Calvin Murphy, and he gave a wildly honest and freewheeling interview. But I'll mention one thing. Calvin Murphy, in addition to being a Hall of Fame basketball player, was one of the top baton twirlers in the country.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
He would do these competitions all the way up into the NBA. He's raising money to participate in these competitions, basically. And so on my Substack, which I can't remember the exact title, but or name of the Substack, but you can look it up. I wrote a long post about Calvin Murphy's baton twirling career. One of those little things that I couldn't fit into the book, but I was just like, that is so interesting that I wanted to write more about it.
What do they call that? A little like extras, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then of course Billy Cunningham, who I remember him as an older player in the league. And then I guess he was kind of a younger coach because he played until like the mid 70s. So by the early 80s, he was only probably in his 40s.
Yeah, he blows out his knee in 75, and so he's in his early to mid 30s. Then he takes over the Sixers in 78, and so yeah, he's in his mid to late 30s, and he has a really amazing run as the Sixers head coach. But I was able to talk to him in Florida, and he lives in Florida, and he never coaches again after coaching the Sixers, even though I think by the time he retired, he had the highest winning percentage of any coach in history at that point. And it took everything out of him. He was a guy who could not do anything, half-assed. He had to go all in. And I think that by that time, it just coaching, he realized that if he kept doing it, he wasn't going to live, basically.
Yeah, that's kind of a feeling that I get from the book, and that's maybe one of the contributors to how the team had kind of a falling off the year after winning the championship, the hangover. They had reached the mountaintop, and I guess Cunningham was sort of burned out at that point. I don't know how much longer did he last.
He retired, and he lasted 2 more seasons after that, and he had a couple of young kids at home. I think that he recognized that coaching basketball was bad for everything else in his life, and so he got out and never went back.
Yeah, and then of course Kareem, who this is the last basketball card that refers to him as Lou Alcindor, his birth name, but Kareem makes several appearances in the book, as sort of the guy that Moses tortures because they have 2 very, very different games. And Moses is a little too physical for him, especially since Kareem by that time frame was, in his early 30s.
Yeah, Kareem wanted nothing to do with Moses. Kareem has that sort of silky skyhook sort of thing, and Moses is just pure bulldog basically, and it was. I mean, Kareem. He faces him twice in the playoffs there, 81 and 83. And even though Kareem is several inches higher than Moses just kills him. I mean, it's really almost comical.
Did you reach out to Kareem or try to reach out to him?
I did, and he, you have to go through his assistant, and he charges for the interview, kind of an exorbitant amount, and I just don't think that's ethical. So I did not interview him.
Yeah, and he's sort of he's a bit character. You don't want to pay money for a bit character, even though he is, of course, one of the greatest players of all time.
Yeah.
So I pulled up one more slide because I know that the first week this book came out, you ended up on the USA Today's bestseller list. Congratulations for that.
Thanks. Something that our team never happened to our team, so I'm glad that this happened. Yeah,
and it's. You would think that it would be kind of a niche market, but I thought, you've got reviews in the Wall Street Journal.
Mm-hmm.
You have a review in the Boston Globe of all places. I would assume the Philadelphia Inquirer also. Did they do?
They did not. But I've been on numerous talk radio stations in Philly, and so really, we're hitting Philly with like the radio waves.
Yeah. And I should say, shout out to my friends TJ's Online and Ray from Philly. There are Philly basketball fans that are rabid fans, and some of them are my friends. So,
awesome. I hope they read it.
They're out there. Cool. And then you've got ABA fans. They're out there. There's a whole ABA book group on Facebook that I'm a member of, and they're very, very much contributors, including some former players.
I should join that group. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll send you a link. So. We're almost at an hour, the magic time. I should say that you had offered to show us some of the autographs that you had gotten from some of the players. So let's see what we got here.
All right. Well, I've got a Moses Malone insert here that I splurged on, because how could you not get that? Let's see. Here's probably one of my the other big splurges here. This has Billy Cunningham, Nate Thurmond, and Sam Jones. Cunningham himself is actually kind of a difficult person to get. He didn't do very many signings, so I had a difficult time coming across that. Here's my Gerald Govan, which I got in person. This is one of the great stars thing, and he wrote on top there, which it's hard to see. It says Go-Go, which was his his nickname. Let's see what else I got here. I, of course, had to get Mr. Pat Riley, who comes into the Lakers coach at that time. Let's see, Jeff Ruland, who a lot of people maybe don't know, but this was who Moses Malone was who the Sixers traded Moses Malone for back in that ill-fated trade in the 1980s. That really killed them.
Well, New Yorkers know Jeff Ruland because Jeff Ruland was from, I believe, Long Island, and he went to Iona College.
Oh, did he?
Iona College got a national reputation as a result of, I think it was Jeff Ruland and one other player that both played in the NBA. And then he went to Washington, and Ruland was a monster in Washington, but I guess
he
also had
injuries. He just got into injuries, which was really unfortunate. Here's my Gene Shue. He was the coach of that Sixers team that you hated, the 1977 Sixers.
I didn't like Gene Shue.
No, I don't think a lot of people did, which is too bad. Oh, I've got your Rory Sparrow right here too.
There you go.
If you're into the Knicks, I was able to talk to Lionel Hollins. He was a teammate of Dr. J's. He played against him in the 1977 finals for that team. Let's see who else we've got. Bobby Gross killed the Sixers during that time. And then let me just I've got several more, but I'll just end it right here. Here's a great little piece that somebody sent to me. This says Caldwell Jones. This is Joe Jellybean. This is Terry Furlow, who died in a car accident in the early 1980s and is a tough one to get. But he was traded. He was traded for a first-round draft pick from the Cleveland Cavaliers, and the 76ers used that first-round draft pick to get Moses Malone. It eventually turned into Ralph Sampson, basically. Henry Bibby is down here, and here is Joe Jellybean Bryant. That would be Kobe Bryant's dad, who was on the 76ers.
I should mention Henry Bibby came up as a New York Knick originally, and then ended up in Philadelphia. Ended up being a really solid player for Philadelphia, and he's from a sports family.
Nice.
His son Mike played in the NBA, and I believe his brother or his cousin, Jim Bibby, was a pitcher, hard-throwing right-hander for the Pirates and the Rangers.
Oh, and I'll just show you this because you seem to like him. Here's. Yep. That's an Al Bianchi on there you know, some of these guys are tough to get because I think a lot of people, you know, collected baseball autographs back then, but some of these guys, if they're just kind of let's say, you know, someone like Steve Mix, there's not as many out there as you would assume, where you have sort of maybe a little lesser known baseball players. And so you might be paying $50 for like a Mark Landsberger autograph or a Lloyd Free World Be Free autograph. They're not as easy to find as you would assume. Anyway, that's
I can tell you, Julius shows up at card shows occasionally. In fact, I was at one at the Philly show several years ago when he walked through the crowd right by me. And, man, every time I see an NBA player, I'm like, wow, I thought I was tall. These guys are
I gotta say, Dan,
monsters.
I mean, you have the good fortune of having seen Julius in the ABA. I'll just say in closing that everybody that I talked to who had covered the ABA, played in the ABA, whatever, told me that if you did not see Julius Erving in the ABA, you actually didn't see Dr. J, because his knees were still good at that time. He hadn't gone under the Sixers team, which kind of stifled his play a little bit. He was really in his full force of his athletic powers. And what we saw in the NBA was still spectacular, but nowhere near the, you know, all-around show that you got in the ABA.
Yeah, two things about that. One is, and you mentioned this in the book, that ABA statistics are not considered professional statistics for a player like Dr. J. So if you compare Dr. J's statistics, although Basketball Reference has them, if you compare his official statistics, they only give you the NBA. So there are people that don't know the full parameters of how amazing this guy was. And the other thing is the dunk. The dunk contest dunk at the last All-Star game in ABA history, which became, you know, a symbol of like the ABA. And then, you know, now people think it's Jordan's dunk. It's not Jordan's dunk. It's Erving's dunk.
Yeah, so, he really sets that template for Michael Jordan to seamlessly step into, including with the shoe sales. I mean, Julius Erving's Converses at that time sold quite well, even though he got very little of that money.
Well, the original sneaker that I remember was Walt Clyde Frazier in the Puma. But to get into the big market. But yeah, so just in conclusion, the subtitle of your book is Two Men, One Championship, and the Birth of Modern Basketball. So I think that kind of takes us out, the whole concept that Michael Jordan as a thing doesn't necessarily turn into the thing he becomes without Julius Erving as the template. I think that's a fair thing to say. You agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said earlier, Julius had to really get over this prejudice that people had about the way that he played. This idea that was a playground style that you did outdoors, but you did not play that way indoors. And so could be a struggle for him to convince coaches that, no, this is a fundamental way that I have taught myself how to be good on the basketball court. Because he had such success that way, including winning an NBA title, someone like Michael Jordan doesn't have to justify the way that he is playing. He can simply come into the league and people will be like, well, that's how Dr. J played. And so it really, I would say, professionalizes the playground. And in that way, that's why I would say that he's like the first real modern player that we have.
All right. And that in many respects, the NBA today reflects more on the ABA than NBA from that early 70s time period.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right. Well, Luke, I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I thoroughly enjoyed this book, both as a fan and also personally because of my own personal experiences. And it's great that you can come on and talk. And I just absolutely wanted to congratulate you on a fantastic book, which has been so far very successful. And I hope that it continues to be.
Thanks, Dan. I'm always happy to talk to you.
Awesome. All right, guys. See you. For Collectors will be back. This is going to air on Wednesday afternoon or Wednesday early evening, but we'll be back on Sunday after that. So take care. So long, folks.
Last year, we at For Collectors hosted the first ever vintage trade night in cooperation with the Strongsville Sports Collectors Convention, and it was a massive success. With the help of our generous sponsors, Collector Investor Auctions, and a few of my favorite things, we are doing it again. After the show on Saturday, April 11th, come to the Independence Holiday Inn for free admission, giveaways, door prizes, and free pizza. This year, it's going to be bigger and better, so be there.
Got this at trade night, at vintage trade night.
Did you really? I didn't know that.
I've been looking for this all week.
Who'd you buy it off?
It's not downstairs, it was up here.
Wow.
This is the place to be.